She knocked on the gate of an unfamiliar ranch with the most profoundly humble voice she had ever managed to use in her entire life. She asked for just one night. Just one. And the man who came to open that wooden door carried an emptiness so ancient inside his chest that he did not even realize, in that very moment, that he was about to have his whole life turned inside out in a way he would never want to undo. Have you ever found yourself in a moment like that? With absolutely nowhere to go. Not the kind of being lost that passes when you turn the right corner, the kind that makes your ankles ache from walking so much, that dries out your throat from swallowing your pride, that makes a young woman stop in front of an old wooden gate on a muggy afternoon in rural Texas and take a deep breath before knocking. Because after you knock, after you reach out your hand and ask, there is no more pretending you don't need it. And pretending she didn't need anything was the only armor she had left. This happened in April of 1938, in the rural outskirts of San Angelo, deep in the Texas plains. The ranch was called St. Thomas, and in those days it survived on cattle, on red dirt, and on a silence that the owner of the property had learned, over the last 2 years, to mistake for peace. It was not peace. He just hadn't found anyone yet who could prove that to him. But before getting into this story with us, do something real quick. Scroll down here to the comments and write where you are watching from. City, state, you can put it all down. We read every single one of those comments with genuine care. And if you want, tell us too if you've ever had a moment in life where you needed someone and weren't exactly sure how to ask. We would love to read it. Now come with us to the Texas plains in 1938, and you will understand why sometimes the humblest request in the world can be the beginning of the most beautiful thing life has to offer. Her name was Olivia Anderson, and she was 24 years old, carrying a canvas suitcase tied with a braided twine cord and the most skilled hands that any sewing needle had ever known in the heartland of the country. Olivia had been born in Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of Sebastian Anderson, a cattle drover who lived more on horseback than indoors, a man of few words and miles of road, who arrived home smelling of trail dust and saddle leather, and who departed before the morning coffee could grow cold. And of Evelyn, a small and precise woman who took in outside sewing to supplement whatever her husband brought in when he brought anything at all, and who had passed down to her daughter, before anything else, the understanding that honest work does not apologize for its existence. Ever since she was 12, Olivia was already mending trousers and hemming skirts at the kitchen table with the same natural ease with which other neighborhood girls played out in the street. It wasn't that she didn't like to play, it was that she liked to sew more. There was something about that repetitive motion, thread pulling thread, needle piercing fabric with that almost imperceptible sound, that made her mind quiet down in a way no other activity could manage. Quiet and awake at the very same time. And Olivia needed that with a frequency she only came to understand when she grew older. The need for an activity that demanded total attention and simultaneously offered a kind of inward rest. As if sewing were the only way she had found to be completely present without having to explain anything to anyone. Her mother died when Olivia was 16 years old, a fever that started on a Monday and simply did not stop. It began as something that seemed like it would pass, then it lingered, then it deepened, and then, on a Thursday of fine rain, Evelyn simply went no further. That shook the house in a way that Sebastian never managed to fully recover from, although he never admitted it in spoken words. He started drinking with more frequency, working with less, spending more time sitting still, looking at nothing on Friday nights, with a glass in his hand and his eyes focused on the middle ground between the present and somewhere Olivia could not name. She saw all of this and said nothing, because she had understood long before she was old enough to understand that sometimes a person's pain does not fit into a conversation, and that forcing entry into those dark places is of no use. That what you can do is stay close by and keep doing the things that need to be done, and that this sometimes is already enough for the other person to know they are not completely alone. What she did was work more, sew more. She started accepting commissions beyond simple mending, party dresses for town weddings, hems on men's trousers, embroidery on tablecloths that the wealthier families in Columbus commissioned for their trousseaux. She had genuine talent, not the kind that needs praise for confirmation, but the kind that other people notice before the person themselves, which appears in the result of the work with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. By the time she was 18, she was already supporting them both with her sewing earnings. Sebastian still did what he could, but what he could do kept getting smaller and smaller, like a river steadily losing volume without anyone noticing, until the stones at the bottom begin to show. When she was 23, her father fell ill. It was not a sudden thing, not the kind of drama that falls all at once and ends quickly. It was a slow wearing down, the kind that a person watches happen but cannot prevent no matter how much they want to. Sebastian began losing weight first, then energy, then his appetite, then the desire to stay awake late. Olivia began caring for him with the same precision she used to care for a delicate fabric, with attention, with patience, without rushing, adjusting what could be adjusted and accepting what lay beyond the reach of her hands. And then, on an August morning in 1937, she went to his room at 6:30, and he was lying with his face turned toward the window, quiet in a way that was entirely different from his other quiet moments. The doctor said his heart had stopped during the night, that it had been fast, that he probably hadn't felt a thing. Olivia sat beside him for a long time before calling the neighbors, holding his cold hand and trying to understand when, exactly, life had transformed into a place she would have to cross completely alone. The burial was simple, just as everything in Sebastian's life had been simple. But when the debts were inventoried in the following days, it was discovered that he had borrowed money from 3 different people over the past few years, debts Olivia had no idea existed. They were not massive sums, but they were enough to make it clear that what was left over after the payments was next to nothing, and that Columbus, with the memories it held, with the debts that weighed heavily, and with the rent for the room they lived in coming due at the end of the month, no longer had much to offer her. That was when she remembered the letter. It had arrived a few months prior, when Sebastian was still alive but already weak, and she had left it safely tucked inside an envelope behind the bedroom mirror, because at the time she had been too busy caring for her father to open it with the attention it deserved. The letter was from Dean, a distant cousin on her father's side, who lived in Abilene, Texas, and who said he needed a trustworthy seamstress to work for a lady in the city. Good pay, the letter said. Room and board included. It was an invitation. It was a way out. It was the only door that seemed to be open when all the others were firmly shut. Olivia reread the letter 3 times. Then she folded it, placed it in her suitcase, sold what there was to sell, paid what there was to pay, tucked whatever money was left into a fold of fabric inside her bag, tied the suitcase with the exact same braided twine her father used to secure his cargo bundles, and caught the first transport heading toward Texas. She had left Columbus without looking back, not because she felt nothing, but because she knew if she looked back, it would take her far too long to keep walking. The journey was long. She passed through Cincinnati, crossed the Midwest plains in the back of an orange truck, whose driver was a man of few words but safe driving, hitched another ride out of Tulsa in a dusty motor coach that smelled of mixed gasoline and dirt, and arrived in Abilene with her shoulders aching, her skirt dusty, and the conviction that the worst had already passed. The worst had not passed. The address Dean had given in the letter belonged to a boarding house where he stayed whenever he came into town for work. The owner of the boarding house, a man with a long nose and a highly selective memory, said that the young man had vanished about 2 months ago. And before that he had left a message saying he was heading out to New Mexico looking for work. Where exactly, he didn't know. Had he left any contact information? No. Any names to look up? No, miss, this is a boarding house. I am not an employment agency. Olivia stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, with her suitcase resting on the ground by her feet, for a stretch of time she couldn't possibly measure. All around her, Abilene kept moving forward without noticing. Wagons rolled by, a dog crossed the street, a woman stepped out of a bakery with a wrapped loaf of bread tucked under her arm, without looking at anything other than her own path. The world continued. She needed to continue too. She picked up the suitcase and went. She spent 3 weeks trying to get by in Abilene. She knocked on the doors of seamstresses to offer her services as a helper, managed to get a few sporadic jobs, doing mends and hems, and slept in a tiny boarding house room that swallowed up almost everything she earned. On the 18th day, with her money nearly gone and her hope in Abilene proven to be exhausted, she made a decision that seemed entirely rational in that moment. She would head out to the rural country, to somewhere where things were cheaper, where a woman who knew how to work with her hands might find some corner to stay. There was no precise destination. There was only a direction, inward, toward the west, out to where the prairie opened up and the towns grew quieter and the rhythm of things felt more human. And that was how Olivia Anderson arrived on the outskirts of San Angelo. The last 25 miles she had covered on foot and by catching a ride with an older gentleman driving a wagon loaded with dried corn, who didn't speak a single word during the entire trip, having merely nodded his head when she asked to climb up, and then returned to staring at the road as if she weren't even there. Olivia was not bothered by the silence. She had never been bothered by the silence of strangers. There was something profoundly honest in it, in the refusal to fake an intimacy that did not exist. When the wagon turned down a side path and the older man tipped his chin to indicate that this was his stop, Olivia climbed down, thanked him with a voice that was growing hoarse from thirst, and kept walking down the dirt road that stretched out between the prairie on both sides. It was an April afternoon, which out in the Texas plains meant a heat that could not decide if it was leaving or staying. Humid enough to make a blouse stick to your back, but dry enough to crack your lips. The sun was already sitting at a low angle. It was no longer the middle of the day, but it wasn't quite evening yet, and the light hit the surrounding prairie obliquely, casting long shadows and painting the vegetation with that old gold color the plains acquire when the day has already walked quite a distance, but still does not want to end. The rocks on the road were hot beneath the soles of her sandals. The air smelled of baked earth and some distant flower she couldn't identify, something faintly sweet that appeared and disappeared as the wind shifted directions. The St. Thomas Ranch appeared after a long curve in the road. First the dark wooden gate, then the wire fence extending down both sides of the property as far as the eye could see, then the silhouette of the main house in the background, a single-story home with white walls that time had turned a slightly yellowed white, a clay tile roof darkened by the dampness of past rains, and a porch covered by wooden beams that stretched across the entire front. Next to the main house, a smaller building that looked like a barn, a few trees scattered across the yard, and far off, in the pasture that began on the other side of the house, a few cattle grazed without any hurry beneath the golden light, as if time had nothing to do with them. Olivia stopped in front of the gate. She took a deep breath. There were 3 ranches she had passed before this one, and at all 3 she had kept on walking without stopping. At 2 of them the gate was locked tight, and there was something in their solidity that didn't offer an opening even for the thought of trying. At the 3rd, There was a dog that barked in a way that left absolutely no doubt about what would happen if she tried to step inside. But at this one, the gate was merely pushed to, not latched, just leaning against the post with the slight pressure of someone who left it cracked to let the breeze through. And there was a figure standing at the back of the yard, near the barn, with broad shoulders, moving with the cadence of someone who has known every inch of that ground since before he ever needed to think about it. She set her suitcase down, pushed the gate open carefully, moving slowly like someone who doesn't want to trespass, only to ask for passage. The wood creaked softly. She stepped inside, walked to the middle of the red dirt yard, and stood completely still, waiting to be seen. The figure near the barn turned around, and Olivia raised her hand and said, with a voice that came out trying to be firm, but which carried built within it the heavy exhaustion of 2 days on the road, "Excuse me, sir." Marcus Vance was 36 years old and had the face of a man who was not expecting any visitors. He stopped what he was doing, which was fixing a loose board on the barn door frame with a hammer he still held in his hand, and stared at that figure standing in the middle of his yard. A young woman, of slender build, with a canvas suitcase on the ground by her feet, and her hand raised in a gesture that was at once a greeting and a plea. Her skirt was dusted with dirt all the way to the hem. Her hair, a dark brown, was pulled into a side braid that had partially come undone in the heat, leaving loose strands clinging to the side of her neck. Her eyes, large and dark, looked directly at him, with a mixture of determination and sheer exhaustion that he recognized immediately, even without having the exact words to name it. It was the expression of someone who had reached their absolute limit, but was still standing. Someone who is asking because they have no other option, but who's asking with the dignity of someone who is not asking for a single thing more than they need. He walked toward her with his usual calm pace, the hammer still in his hand, and stopped at a respectful distance. She introduced herself, said her name, said she was traveling, said she had run out of the means to keep going that afternoon, and asked, with a direct voice that neither stalled nor made herself small, if there was somewhere she might spend the night. She made it completely clear she wasn't asking for a favor with nothing in return. Sewing, cleaning, cooking, helping with whatever was needed. She would work for whatever she required in exchange for just one night. Just one. Marcus did not answer immediately. That silence lasted a few seconds that felt much longer than they actually were. He looked at her, looked at the suitcase, looked back up into her eyes. There was something in that face he couldn't name right away. It wasn't the kind of beauty that hits you straight on. It was something else entirely, a distinct quality of presence. As if that woman occupied exactly the space she was in, no more and no less, with a calm precision that the vast majority of people simply did not possess. He said he had a back room, that she could stay for the night, that in the morning they would see. He asked no further questions. He demanded no explanations. He turned around and walked back to the barn, as if the matter was entirely settled, with the clear objectivity of someone who had made a decision and moved on to the next task. Olivia stood still for a second, processing the fact that she had succeeded. Then she grabbed her suitcase and followed. It was Miss Martha who came to meet her before she even reached the door of the main house. Martha was a 60-year-old woman with a presence that filled a room long before her body actually entered it. Short stature, rounded shoulders, white hair pinned back in a bone clip darkened by years of use, hands that revealed decades of hard labor in every single detail. She looked at Olivia with the expression of someone who has seen a great deal pass through the world and has taken the time to learn how to distinguish what is worthwhile from what is not without needing much time to do it. She stood there for a few seconds just looking. Then she said, in a practical and straightforward manner for the girl to come inside, that there was water for her to wash up and food coming shortly. The back room was small but incredibly clean. A dark wooden bed with a mattress covered by a cotton sheet, a window with a faded cloth curtain that the breeze moved ever so slightly, a coat hook on the wall, and a small table holding a ceramic basin and a water pitcher. It smelled of old wood and something it took her a second to identify: dried lavender. A scent that was not unpleasant. Quite the opposite. There was something deeply intentional about it, as if someone had placed those lavender stems there on purpose in some bygone time, and the memory of that gesture had lingered in the air long after the person who made it was no longer around. Olivia set the suitcase on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and stayed perfectly quiet for a moment. She was exhausted in the way that pierces the flesh and goes deep into the bone, the kind of weariness you feel when you can finally sit down after walking for a very long time, when the body realizes it is allowed to stop and decides to collect its toll all at once. But she was inside four walls, with the promise of water, of food, and of a night's rest. And that, on that particular afternoon, was entirely enough. Dinner was served in the large kitchen at a long, dark wooden table that could seat 8, but was set for 3. Marcus walked in with his hands already washed, sat down in the chair at the head of the table without any ceremony, and Miss Martha placed a pot of pinto bean stew, a basket of warm buttermilk biscuits, and a platter of roasted meat right in the center. The kitchen smelled of burning firewood, of beans heavily seasoned with garlic, and of those buttermilk biscuits that are so specific to the South, a smell she didn't know well, but which her stomach recognized long before her memory could. Olivia stood near the doorway, unsure exactly whether she should sit down or wait to be called. Martha pointed to the chair right next to her, with a gesture that admitted no argument. She sat down. For a while, the only sound was of spoons clinking and stew being served into bowls. Marcus made no conversation. It wasn't rudeness. It was simply his way. He spoke when he had something concrete to say, and in that moment, he didn't. Olivia, who had grown up living alongside her father's long stretches of silence, recognized that quality in his quietness and made no attempt to fill it with unnecessary words. She let the silence simply be what it was. Martha, however, asked 2 short questions: where she was from and what she knew how to do. Olivia answered both with objective truth. She was from Ohio, and she was a seamstress. A good seamstress, she added, not out of vanity, but because it was relevant. Martha said that was good, because she had a pile of mending that had been accumulating for longer than she cared to admit, and her eyesight hadn't been good enough for fine work in quite some time. Marcus lifted his eyes from his plate for a brief second, looked at Martha, and went back to his plate. He said nothing, but there was in that look, Olivia noticed, something very close to an agreement that did not need to be announced out loud. She would sleep, and she would see what happened in the morning. She slept a heavy, dreamless sleep, the kind the body enforces when it has been pushed far too far. She woke up before the sun, carrying the old habit of someone who always had things to do early, of someone who learned back in childhood that the morning you waste never comes back. She lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up. A rooster far off in the distance, repeating its call 3 times with precise intervals. The distant lowing of a cow out in the pasture. The wind brushing through the leaves of a tree right near her window with that rustling whisper that shifts in tone depending on the speed. Through the gap in the curtain, the sky was just starting to lighten with that pre-blue shade of blue. The kind that only exists in the very first minutes after the darkness lifts, when the night isn't completely gone, but the day is already pulling in. She got up. She folded the bedsheet with meticulous care, arranged the suitcase she hadn't fully unpacked because she had fallen asleep before having the energy to do so, and opened the bedroom door, taking care to make absolutely no noise. The kitchen was quiet and dark, the wood stove unlit, the coals cold. There was a pot on the table, and up on a shelf above the stove among other tins, one she recognized by smell before she even opened it. Coffee. The prairie right outside the kitchen window was a grey-blue in the pre-dawn, that soft blue that doesn't last more than a few minutes before turning bright gold. She lit the stove with the firewood stacked beside it, brewed the coffee, found 2 mugs hanging on a nail in the wall, and set them on the table. Then she found the wicker basket in the corner that Martha had gestured vaguely toward the night before, with a wave that assumed any competent person would know what to do with it. The basket was overflowing with mending, shirts with clean tears at the elbow and the shoulder, trousers with undone hems, bed sheets with holes worn by time, an apron with a snapped strap. Months of accumulated labor, the kind that gets left behind because it never seems quite urgent enough to become the priority of the day, until suddenly it becomes an entire mountain. Olivia grabbed the shirt sitting on top, which had a clean tear on the right elbow, and set to work. When Marcus walked into the kitchen 40 minutes later, there was fresh coffee ready. There was a good smell occupying the room in a completely different way from the emptiness of all his previous mornings. And there was that woman sitting at the table with a shirt folded in her lap, her needle moving with a speed and precision he never expected to see from anyone at that hour of the morning. She raised her eyes when she heard his footsteps. She said good morning with a voice that still carried a little bit of sleep, but was perfectly clear. She pointed to the coffee pot and said the coffee was ready, that she had made it strong, but it might be that he preferred it weaker, and that next time she would adjust it if he told her how he liked it. Marcus walked over to the stove, picked up the pot, poured himself a mug without rushing, stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the yard through the window, where the light was just beginning to turn golden across the red dirt. Then he turned around, leaned back against the stove, holding the mug with both hands, and looked at her for a few seconds. He said the coffee was good. She nodded, returning her attention to the mending. He drank his coffee, staring out at the yard through the window. She sewed, keeping her eyes on the shirt. And there was, in the silence of those minutes, a highly specific quality, neither uncomfortable nor forced, merely the quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill the air with words to confirm that they were fine. When he finished his mug and went to set it in the sink, he looked down at the shirt she was just finishing mending. It was one of his shirts, a work shirt, the beige linen one, which he had tossed onto the pile without thinking much about it maybe 3 weeks ago. The tear was being closed with a tiny, impeccably regular stitch that looked as though it had come straight out of a machine. He said nothing about the shirt. He just stood looking at it for a second. Then he walked out the back door to begin the day's labor. And Olivia finished the mend, folded the shirt neatly, and picked up the next piece from the pile. The conversation about staying didn't happen like a proper conversation. It happened the way certain important things in life happen, sideways, almost in passing, in a way that seems entirely too small for the heavy weight it carries. On the afternoon of that very first day, when Olivia had finished nearly all the mends in the basket, when she had also helped Martha peel potatoes for dinner with a knife skill that made the older woman raise a single eyebrow in approval without offering a comment, Marcus came in for lunch, sat down, ate, stood up from the table, and as he was walking through the kitchen said, without breaking his stride and without looking directly at her, "If you want to keep up with the sewing work, you can stay as long as there's things to do. There's a bed and food." It was not a warm invitation, it wasn't formal. It was simply a sentence spoken with the exact same objectivity of a man making a comment about the weather. Martha, who was standing with her back turned washing a pot, did not move. But there was a minuscule shift in her shoulders, the slightest curve that suggested something deeply contained. Olivia said she was grateful and that she would do her part. Marcus nodded without turning around and walked out. And just like that, without ceremony and without an exact formal agreement, Olivia Anderson stayed on at the St. Thomas Ranch. Those first days held the texture of an adaptation that neither of them put a name to, but which both could feel taking shape. Olivia learned the schedules of the house through pure observation, which was exactly how she had learned the vast majority of things in her life. Coffee at 5:30. Marcus headed out for the chores at 6, sometimes earlier. Lunch right at noon, punctual as a wall clock. The afternoon was for continuous work. Dinner at 6:30. After dinner, Marcus would go out to the porch and stay there for a length of time that varied between 30 minutes and an hour, staring out at the yard and at the prairie beyond, before coming inside and going to his room. She learned the details of the ranch little by little, as if she were collecting fragments of a map no one had bothered to draw in full. She discovered that the larger outbuilding was for tools and lumber, and the smaller one was the tack room, carrying a highly specific scent of leather and saddle grease that she found much more pleasant than she expected. That there was a garden plot behind the house that Martha tended with a dedication that felt deeply personal, almost intimate, pulling weeds while kneeling in the dirt with the sheer concentration of someone solving an important problem. That the ranch dog, a red mutt with uneven ears named Rusty, barked at practically everything that moved, except for Marcus, whom he followed like a silent shadow. On the third day, the first little thing happened that she would hold on to later. Olivia was out on the porch that afternoon, patching a canvas tarp for the barn, when Marcus walked past holding a bucket. She had made the coffee that morning without any sugar because it had run out, and she hadn't found any more in the cupboard she was familiar with yet, and she was left wondering whether she should ask or simply wait to see. So she asked, without lifting her eyes from the tarp, "Where do you keep the sugar in this house, Mr. Marcus?" He stopped, said it was in a blue jar in the bottom cabinet, 3rd shelf. She nodded and went right back to work. He stood perfectly still for a second. Then he said, almost in passing, that his coffee never needed any sugar anyway. She raised her eyes right at that moment, just for 1 second. She saw that he was already turning to walk away, the bucket in his hand, his stride already pointed in another direction. And there was something in the way he had said it, so casual, so completely devoid of apparent intention, that she couldn't quite classify it properly. It just lingered with her, that tiny sentence, for the rest of the afternoon and into part of the night. That very same night, after the house grew quiet, Olivia went to the cabinet, located the blue jar, scooped out 2 spoonfuls of sugar, and mixed it right into the coffee grounds that would go into the pot the following morning. She didn't say a word to anyone. She just did it. The next morning, Marcus picked up his mug, took his first sip, and stood perfectly quiet for a moment, looking out the window. He didn't say it tasted different. He made no comment that there was sugar when he hadn't asked for any. He could have said it, if he wanted to. He didn't, and she, who was watching from the corner of her eye while she mended the next piece, saw that he hadn't said a thing. And she felt in a way she didn't put a name to, but which left a strange lightness resting in her chest for a good portion of the morning, that his silence was its own kind of answer too. Olivia had kept the habit of folded papers since she was a teenager. They were scraps of anything, pages torn from old notebooks, the margins of packaging, a blank receipt the grocer had handed over without using. She would fold them into quarters and slip them into her apron pocket, and throughout the day, whenever something surprised her, a word she heard for the first time and thought was beautiful, a detail of the world around her she wanted to keep, an observation that didn't fit into a conversation with anyone, she would take the pencil she always kept tucked in her hair behind her left ear and write it down. It was a way of filing things away, of not losing what happened in the minute details. Her mother had done it too, in a little blue notebook that Olivia still kept packed in her suitcase but never actually opened, because opening it felt like far too much on some days and entirely too possible on others. At the St. Thomas Ranch, the papers began filling up with things completely different from her usual notes. On a Tuesday paper, the huisache tree blooms from the bottom up. I learned that today, looking at the tree by the gate. On a Wednesday paper, the prairie smells completely different before 6 in the morning. It smells like wet night dirt, mixed with something sweet I don't know the name of yet. On a Thursday paper, Rusty barks exactly 3 times before laying down. Every single night. I counted 4 days in a row. And on a paper she folded with a bit more care than the others. On a sunny afternoon, she would remember later for entirely different reasons. He stopped 3 times today near the garden plot. He just stood looking. He doesn't tend it, he doesn't harvest anything, he just looks. I don't know what he's looking for out there, but he looks with deep attention. She didn't know, because there was no way for her to know just yet, that the garden had been planted by Anna, Marcus's wife. That every single row had been thought out by her with the highly specific logic of someone planning for long-term growth. That Marcus walked by there sometimes merely to see if anything was still sprouting up on its own, from some forgotten seed that was still trying. It was a visit he had invented for himself without ever calling it by that name. But Olivia had noticed the look. She had written it down. And she had felt, without being able to precisely explain why, that there was something deeply important in that look that she didn't understand yet, but wanted to. It was during the second week that the afternoon of the trees took place. Olivia had developed the habit of stepping out into the yard with her apron still on at the end of every afternoon, right when the prairie heat started to break and the sun hung red and low on the horizon. Just standing there for a while looking at the vegetation surrounding the ranch. It wasn't a stroll, it was more like an interval her body demanded after hours of being hunched over fabric, a way to stretch not just her limbs, but her mind as well. On that particular afternoon, she was standing near the fence, looking at a cluster of trees on the edge of the pasture that she couldn't identify. They had thick, twisted trunks, dark bark with an almost harsh visual texture, small, dense leaves that the wind pushed against without bending easily, as if they had learned how to resist. She heard his footsteps on the red dirt before she actually saw him. Marcus stopped beside her, not too close, keeping a respectful distance, and stood looking out in the exact same direction. It was the first time the two of them had stood side by side without any specific task to justify the proximity. She said she didn't know the name of those trees. He stayed quiet for a second. Then he told her they were young wild pawpaws, that they took many years to really grow, and that when they did, in the proper season, they yielded a fruit with a strong smell that most folks from outside Texas found incredibly strange their first time. She asked if he liked pawpaws. He said he did, that he had grown up eating savory pawpaw mash on Fridays because that was the way his mother used to make it, loaded with plenty of garlic and pepper. She said she had never tasted it and that she would like to try it whenever the season came. He didn't reply right away. The two of them stood looking at the young pawpaw trees for a few seconds while the wind swept past carrying a different, damper scent. Of earth that had held onto the rain from days ago in some hidden place the sun hadn't reached yet. Then he pointed to a larger tree, a little further to the left, with smoother bark, and said that one was a Texas olive tree, and that the Texas olive bloomed in late summer with tiny white flowers that looked exactly like snow to anyone who had never seen real snow. He said that old Ben, who had worked on the ranch for decades and had taught him every single plant name he knew, used to say the Texas olive was the only kind of snow the prairie could ever manage to invent for itself. Olivia stood looking at the Texas olive tree for a moment. Then, without any dramatic flair, she pulled the scrap of paper from her apron pocket and the pencil from behind her ear and wrote it down. Texas olive, blooms in late summer, prairie snow, Old Ben said so. Marcus looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. There was an expression on his face that she didn't fully catch because she was looking down at the paper, but which Martha, who had watched the entire thing from the kitchen window with her hands still wet from washing dishes, saw with the absolute clarity of someone who has been observing the important things in the world for 6 full decades. It was the expression of a man who had been completely surprised by something good. Not surprised by a fright, but surprised by a discovery. They stood out there for another 20 minutes. He went on saying the names of the trees and shrubs she pointed to, one by one, with a patience that required no effort, and she went on writing everything down on the paper until she ended up needing a second scrap, because she ran out of room on the first. When the sun vanished completely and the sky turned a deep purple with the very first stars pressing through, the two of them walked back toward the house without agreeing to it. They walked side by side across the red dirt yard, illuminated by the last light of the day, and neither of them said a word. But there was in the silence of that shared walk a very specific quality, completely different from all the other silences. Less empty, more whole. On a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Olivia had arrived at the ranch, one of those tiny episodes occurred that memory guards with far more care than the grand events. She was stepping down off the porch when the heel of her sandal, which had been somewhat loose for a while but which she had kept putting off fixing, finally gave way all at once. She didn't fall. She balanced herself well, but the heel remained on the step and the sandal broke into 2 separate pieces right in her hand. Olivia looked down at the sandal for a second with the calm expression of someone performing silent calculations. What it will cost, what resources are available to fix it, what the options are. Marcus had just walked out of the small attack room at that exact moment and saw it happen. He walked over to her without saying a word, looked at the sandal, took both pieces straight out of her hand with a direct gesture, and walked right back into the tack room. He stayed in there for about 15 minutes. When he came back out, the sandal was entirely whole, the heel firmly reattached with a perfectly set nail and cobbler's glue, a remarkably clean and functional repair. He handed the sandal back without a word. She took it, examined the handiwork, and told him it was very well done. He said it was nothing and turned to resume what he had been doing. And it was then that she said, using that direct tone that was her absolute trademark, that he hadn't needed to do that. He stopped. He didn't turn around completely. He stood in profile for a second, and he said he knew she didn't need him to do it, that he had done it because he had wanted to. And then he walked back toward the barn, as if the conversation was thoroughly closed. Olivia stood perfectly still, holding the sandal in her hand for a moment. Then she slipped it on and went about her chores for the day. But that night, before blowing out the oil lamp, she pulled the folded paper from her pocket and wrote, with letters just a little smaller than usual, "He fixed my sandal. I didn't ask. He didn't speak. He just did it." Miss Martha was the kind of person who didn't need to ask anything to know everything. She had arrived at the St. Thomas Ranch 12 years ago, brought by Marcus's wife, a woman named Anna, whom Martha had met in a neighboring town where she worked in a family-run bakery. Anna was the kind of woman who noticed the people around her with a genuine attention that very few possess, especially those who were in transitional circumstances. And there was something in Martha that she had recognized as permanence. She had invited her to come work at the ranch. Martha had accepted, and she had stayed. When Anna died of a fever in 1936, Martha had stayed on too. There was nowhere else to go that was worth more than staying. There existed within her an ancient loyalty that demanded no explanations and needed no periodic renewals. It simply endured. And there was the acute awareness that Marcus, in that particular moment, desperately needed someone who would stay without turning it into a grand declaration. She had witnessed the entire process, From the sharp, agonizing pain of the first days, to the slow hardening of the months that followed, to the massive wall he slowly built around himself, brick by single brick, every brick constructed out of hard labor and silence. Martha had never tried to tear the wall down because she understood that the wall served a necessary function during that period. But there had come a point, about 6 months before Olivia showed up, where she had started looking at that wall and thinking that it had fulfilled its function far too well and was becoming much heavier than it needed to be. When Olivia appeared at the gate on that April afternoon, Martha evaluated her with the eyes of someone who has no time to waste on illusions. What she saw, hands with real labor in them, sheer honesty in her eyes, and a way of inhabiting the space around her that was neither invasive nor timid. It was deeply balanced. Olivia didn't walk into a room trying to change anything. She walked in and fit herself into it with the natural precision of an expertly executed mend, the kind where in the end you look and can barely even see the seam. And what Martha went on seeing over the following days: Marcus arriving for coffee 10 minutes earlier than his usual habit, Marcus lingering much longer than necessary near the porch on the afternoons Olivia was working out there, Marcus answering her questions using far more words than he used to answer any other human being who crossed through the ranch. Martha kept all of this stored away with the care of someone who knows full well that certain seeds need to grow in the dark for a while before they can ever show their face to the light. It was on a Friday in May, nearly a month after Olivia's arrival, that Gerald Vance's green truck pulled into the yard, kicking up a cloud of red dust visible from miles down the road. Gerald was 30 years old and 2 handspans shorter than his older brother, sharing Marcus's dark hair but possessing a smile that Marcus simply didn't have. A smile belonging to someone who found humor in almost everything that had happened so far and was fully expecting to find humor in everything still to come. He was a man who walked into a room, and the room instantly felt different, not in a disruptive way, but in the way the presence of a naturally lively person shifts the temperature of an environment without anyone needing to explain how. He stepped out of the truck already talking, calling out Martha's name, yelling for the dog, loudly demanding to know where Marcus was since he hadn't shown his face in 2 whole months. When he saw Olivia sitting on the porch, he stopped, not out of discomfort or suspicion, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who just discovered something highly unexpected inside a drawer they thought they knew. She had a cotton dress resting in her lap that she was re-seaming, and she raised her eyes with that steady calm that was her signature. She said good afternoon. He said good afternoon back, and stood perfectly still for a second, taking an inventory of the situation with his eyes. Then he introduced himself as Marcus's brother and asked, with the blunt frankness of someone who had never learned how to beat around the bush, "And who might you be, ma'am?" She gave her name, explained that she had arrived almost a month ago, that she was helping out with the sewing and the daily chores of the house. He nodded his head slowly, scanning the ranch around them with the eyes of a man comparing what he is currently seeing with what he filed away the last time he stood there. He looked at the porch with the potted plants that had magically appeared, at the dirt yard that was swept far cleaner than usual, at the kitchen window from which a rich smell of cooking drifted out. He looked right back at her, and he said, with the simple clarity of someone observing the weather rather than building an argument, "Ah, so that's where the smell of a home that got back into this place is coming from." Olivia furrowed her brow slightly. She said she didn't quite understand. Gerald said that back when Anna was still alive, the ranch had the smell of a home that he had never been able to describe using actual words, but which he recognized the second he came through the gate, and that after she was gone, the place had started losing that feeling little by little, so incredibly slowly that you only noticed it if you looked backward. And that today, walking through the gate, he had felt it before he even saw anything, and he hadn't known why until right this second. He said all of this with absolutely no intention of making anyone emotional, merely with the simplicity of a man describing exactly what he perceived, and that was precisely why it cut so deep. Olivia said nothing. She simply went back to her sewing. But there was a flush of red spreading across her cheeks that the heat of the late afternoon, on its own, could not entirely explain away. That night, after dinner, while Olivia was helping Martha put the dishes away and the two brothers had walked out to the porch holding a glass each, Gerald sat in silence for a stretch of time that for him was unusual enough that Marcus took notice. Marcus waited, because he knew his brother well enough to know that whenever Gerald fell quiet, it was because he was choosing his words with a care that was not his habitual way, and that when that happened, it was because whatever was about to come out actually mattered. Gerald said, staring out at the dark yard beyond the edge of the porch, "That young woman has a mighty good presence about her." Marcus said she was a good, hard worker. Gerald said that was not what he was saying. Marcus said he knew exactly what his brother was talking about, and that he could go ahead and talk about something else. Gerald took a long, slow drink from his glass. He stayed quiet for another moment. Then he said, with a voice that had dropped its customary humor and gained something far more serious, "You are 36 years old, Marcus. Anna left us 2 years ago. Life did not wait for you when you showed up in it the first time, and it is not going to wait for you now." Marcus did not answer. Gerald didn't push it any further. He had said what needed to be said, and he knew full well that the right words don't require repetition to do their work. The two of them sat in complete silence, staring out at the dark prairie past the edge of the yard, where the crickets were making that continuous droning sound that is the sound of the country at night, and which anyone who grew up out there learns to hear as a backdrop, not as noise. The book was always resting on Marcus's nightstand. It was small, bound in a brown leather cover deeply worn at the edges from use and time, and anyone who walked into the bedroom would see it immediately because it sat in the only empty spot on the table. But no one ever went into Marcus's bedroom. Martha only went in to clean on Wednesday mornings when he was out in the pasture, and she had learned to run the dusting cloth carefully around the book without ever touching it, carrying the deep respect of someone who recognizes that there are objects that are not merely objects. The book had belonged to Anna. She had purchased it at a bookstore in Dallas during one of their rare trips to the big city together, and she had begun reading it on the ride back, sitting in the seat of the motor coach, with her legs tucked up and the book held high against the window pane because the lighting was better that way. She read slowly, savoring every word, and she had made it to page 112 when the fever set in. She had folded the page corner down with extreme care, tucked inward just the way she always folded it when she was stopping, and placed the book on the nightstand with the simple intention of continuing it that night. She had not continued. Marcus had found the book sitting there when he finally returned to the bedroom in the early hours of the morning after the last of the people had gone away, and he had stood perfectly still, staring at it for a very long time. Then he had picked it up, opened it to page 112, read the 2 lines resting at the very top of the page, about 2 characters standing at a window, staring out at a rain-slicked street, and closed the book. Set it back down. For 2 solid years he had done that every single night before blowing out the oil lamp. He opened it to 112. He read the 2 lines. He closed it. He put it back on the table. It wasn't profound sadness every single night. He had moved past the sharp agony of grief a long time ago. It was more like a silent daily verification, a way of saying, without speaking a word to anyone, "I remember you. I am still standing here. You were still on this page." The connection involving the book happened in a way Marcus could never have predicted. which was entirely understandable given that he hadn't predicted any of the ways Olivia's existence had woven itself into the fabric of the ranch. It was on an afternoon of fine, misty rain, the first since she had arrived, that the porch became far too small for the heavy scent of damp earth the prairie released, and the two of them ended up sitting in the parlor, each occupied with what they had. Him with the ranch's ledger book, her with a delicate hem that required good light to keep the stitches straight. The parlor had a small bookshelf against the side wall, made of dark wood, holding a few volumes and odds and ends that had nowhere else to belong. Olivia looked over at it for a moment, while giving her eyes a rest from the sewing needle. She said, with no specific intention other than filling the silence in a natural way, "Do you like to read, sir?" Marcus said he liked it fine, whenever there was the time and the headspace for it. She said she had grown up without many books in her house, but that her father had kept one that she had read so many times over the years that she knew certain parts by heart. When he asked which one it was, she told him the title. It was the exact same book. The exact same book that had been sitting on Marcus's nightstand for 2 years, holding a folded crease on page 112. The silence that followed was entirely different from all the other silences that had stretched between them up to that point. It carried a highly specific quality, the feeling of something massive being suddenly squeezed into a very small space. The profound sensation that the room had shifted sizes without the walls ever having moved. Marcus sat looking at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not fully decipher. There was something in him that looked like surprise, but far deeper than ordinary shock, as if it wasn't just the book, but the book piled on top of everything else. Her sitting there in that parlor on a rainy day, her writing down the names of the trees on a folded scrap of paper, her putting sugar in his coffee without mentioning it, her mending his clothes without asking permission, her showing up asking for a single night and staying in a way that, somehow, he still didn't know how to articulate, had made the entire house feel completely different. He asked, with a voice that sounded slightly altered from his usual tone, if she had read the entire book. She said yes, several times. She said the ending had turned out different from what she had expected the first time through, but that after rereading it, she had decided it was the only ending that actually made sense for that story. He simply said, "Yeah." Just a single syllable, spoken in a way she wouldn't know how to properly classify, but which lingered with her when she went to sleep that night, and was still right there when she woke up the following morning. If you are enjoying this story and want to see it through to the end, hit the bell icon here on the channel and leave a like. It really helps us keep bringing these stories to you. That very same night, Marcus opened the book to 112, just as he had done every single night prior. He stared down at the 2 lines describing the scene at the rain-slicked window. Then, for the absolute first time in 2 years, he did not close the book after the 2 lines. He stared at page 112 for a while. Then he turned it over to 113. He read a paragraph. Then another. The scene by the window continued onto the next page. The 2 characters were still standing there, and there were more things they had left to say to one another. He sat reading for almost an hour, moving slowly through the story that had been stalled on that folded page for 2 long years. He couldn't explain exactly why he had done that on that particular night. But there was a deep honesty within him that wouldn't let him pretend he didn't know exactly which direction the urge had come from. There was a woman who had casually said on a rainy afternoon that she knew that book by heart. And there was something inside him, upon hearing that had shifted in a way it had not shifted in a very long time. He finally closed the book when sleep began pulling at him. Before blowing out the oil lamp, he stared at the worn leather cover for a moment, and he thought in a way that was half thought and half feeling that there were things in life that stayed frozen, just waiting for the exact right time, and that maybe the right time didn't announce itself with a brass band. Maybe it arrived on a rainy afternoon, wrapped in a woman sitting across the parlor, sewing a hem, speaking the title of a book that had been stalled on a folded page for far too long. The letter arrived on a June morning, brought by the delivery man who passed through every 15 days, carrying the mail for the rural properties in the region. It was addressed to Olivia Anderson in care of the St. Thomas Ranch, which clearly revealed that someone had done the legwork to track her down, likely someone back in Abilene, where she had worked those 3 weeks and left a forwarding contact. The letter was from a woman named Mrs. Penelope Silver, from Dallas, the widow of a wealthy family who had heard of Olivia's remarkable skills through a seamstress acquaintance. Mrs. Penelope was in need of a live-in seamstress to manage the family's wardrobe and the trousseau pieces that were piling up. The pay she was offering was good, genuinely good, a sum Olivia had never managed to earn in a single month of her entire life. There was a private room provided, guaranteed meals, and the letter stated that the lady was agreeable and respectful to work for. The position was open and waiting for her reply. Olivia read the letter twice on the morning it was handed to her. Then she folded it up and tucked it into her apron. Martha had seen the delivery man, had seen the letter, and said absolutely nothing. But she kept watching Olivia's face with that silent, focused attention that was her particular way of participating in the things that truly mattered. Olivia worked her normal routine that day. She ate lunch normally. She chatted with Martha about the garden with her usual cadence. But there was something undeniably different in the way she looked at things throughout that afternoon. A quality of taking a soft inventory, as if she were registering details without knowing exactly why she was doing it. Marcus noticed during dinner that she was quiet in a way that was slightly different from her usual quiet moments. But he didn't ask. It wasn't his nature to push directly into things that the other person hadn't willingly brought to the table yet. And perhaps there was a part of him that strongly preferred not to know what exactly had arrived inside that envelope. That night, Olivia lay flat on the small bed in the back room, staring up at the ceiling for a very long time. There was a cricket chirping right near the window, the steady, rhythmic sound she had learned to find deeply comforting. The breeze shifted the curtain just slightly. The room smelled of the dried lavender that had been the very first thing she noticed when she stepped inside for the first time, and which had become, without her ever planning it, the scent her mind firmly associated with the feeling of being allowed to rest. Mrs. Penelope's offer was good. It was better than good. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had left Columbus searching for when she set out all those months ago. Real stability, fair pay, a place with a proper name and a solid address. What she had at the St. Thomas Ranch didn't have a name yet. There was work which she had honored faithfully since the very first day. There was Martha, who had become a daily presence she had never planned on missing, but already knew for certain she would. There was the prairie that she was slowly learning to read like a text in a brand new language, where every plant was a word, and every single dawn was a different sentence. There were the folded paper scraps crammed full of notes that she had never taken about any place before, about anything before, in that volume and with that level of specificity. And there was Marcus. She didn't put a name to what existed with Marcus. She lay there, looking at the ceiling, and refused to name it because naming it meant having to decide what to do with whatever it was, and she simply wasn't ready for that just yet. But there was something, that much she knew with the stark honesty that had always been her trademark, something that was growing in the empty spaces between the words they left unspoken, in the looks that lingered a single second longer than necessary before being pulled away. In the early morning coffees that had started as a mere habit and had become, without anyone announcing it, the part of her day where she felt most awake before she was even fully awake. She had arrived asking for a single night. One night had turned into 2 full months, and now there was a letter stating that there was an entire life waiting for her somewhere else, an organized life with clearly defined borders, which common sense dictated was exactly what she needed. The cricket kept right on chirping, the curtain kept right on moving. Olivia lay looking at the ceiling until sheer exhaustion dragged her back inside herself. That same night, Marcus had spent far more time than usual sitting out on the porch before finally coming inside. He sat staring at the dark yard and at the sky crammed full of stars that rural Texas offered up without the interference of any artificial lights. Rusty was lying at his feet perfectly still, exactly as he always was whenever Marcus sat unmoving for a long time, as if the dog inherently knew these were pauses that didn't demand lively company. Marcus thought about the letter. He didn't know what it said, but he knew it had come from the outside, that there was something in Olivia's manner throughout the day that altered her usual rhythm in a way he had learned to read with a precision that surprised him whenever he stopped to notice it. She had been present, but with a piece of her mind somewhere else, and that had created a strange, hollow feeling inside him that he wasn't accustomed to feeling anymore. He went inside when the sky began to grow deeper and the stars grew sharper. Before lying down, he walked past his bedroom table, opened the book to 112 just as always, and stood looking at the 2 lines. Then this time he flipped to the next page much faster than he had the night before, as if the pause at the folded crease had finally finished doing whatever it was meant to do. The conversation between Marcus and Gerald on the phone at the general store took place 3 days later. Gerald had called out of younger brother curiosity, which was the most ruthlessly efficient form of curiosity that existed. He asked how things were going. Marcus said things were fine. Gerald asked, using that specific way of not asking directly, but asking in a way that made it crystal clear what he was actually asking. How was Olivia doing? Marcus said she had received a job offer out in Dallas. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then Gerald said, "And you?" Marcus said she was perfectly free to do whatever she wanted. Gerald said that wasn't what he had asked. Marcus stayed completely quiet. Gerald said, with a level of patience that wasn't his usual way, that was almost entirely new, "Marcus, Anna left us. And she didn't leave wanting to. And you know, far better than anyone else in this world, that she wouldn't want to see you standing on the outside of life, just waiting for her to come back from somewhere she can never come back from. You know that." Marcus said he knew. Gerald said then the problem wasn't not knowing. It was something else entirely. Marcus stood staring at the wall of the back room of the general store where he had picked up the phone. There was an almanac hanging there, featuring a photograph of a prairie ranch that could have easily been any ranch out in the Texas plains. He stood staring at that photograph for a long moment before answering. Then he said, with a voice that sounded stripped of all its usual defenses, far more bare than his normal tone, that he was afraid to open up and be left empty all over again. Gerald stayed quiet on the other end. Then he said, with a voice that had lost every last trace of his customary smile, "That is the single most honest thing you have said in 2 years, Marcus. In 2 whole years." Marcus didn't answer. Gerald said slowly, "Then you need to think about what's going to be harder to endure. The emptiness if you try, and it doesn't work out. Or the emptiness if you don't even try." The call ended shortly after. Marcus stood completely still in the back room of the general store for a few more minutes, his hat held in his hand, staring at the almanac. The harsh sun outside sliced through the crack in the door and painted a bright line of light across the wooden floorboards. From the front of the store drifted the mingled smells of kerosene, molasses, and roasted coffee. Then he set his hat back on his head and started the walk back to the ranch. That afternoon, Olivia had pulled the letter from her apron and read it for a third time, not to convince herself of anything in particular, but just to let the words settle differently, to see if she could catch something she might have missed in the previous 2 readings. Then she had folded the letter, placed it on the small table in her room, and sat down just looking at it. There was, in that small back room, an accumulation of 2 months of existing that she only truly realized in that exact moment. The way she had arranged the few belongings she owned so they made perfect sense in the available space. The broken piece of mirror that Martha had brought her without her ever asking. The folded scraps of paper she had stashed inside an envelope behind her suitcase because there were far too many to fit in her apron pocket anymore. The ranch had taken on, without her ever planning it, the deep texture of a place she genuinely knew. She was sitting squarely inside that realization when Martha walked into the room without knocking, which was exactly her way. She stopped in the doorway for a second, looked down at the letter on the table, looked at Olivia. Then she stepped inside, sat down on the edge of the bed with the calm certainty of someone who is prepared to stay as long as necessary, and said, using that voice that never apologized for whatever was about to come out, "You know full well there is a reason to stay that isn't written anywhere in that letter." Olivia kept her eyes fixed on the letter. She said she knew. Martha said that sometimes we can't just sit around waiting for things to speak for themselves. That sometimes a person has to be present enough to actually give them the chance to happen. Olivia said it wasn't in her nature to make major life decisions based on what another person might or might not feel. That it wouldn't be fair to her, nor would it be fair to them. Martha said she understood that perfectly, but she added that there was a vast difference between depending entirely on another person's decision and simply giving them the space to reach it on their own. She said Olivia had given him plenty of space, that maybe what was lacking wasn't space, but just a little more time. Olivia stayed quiet. Martha said, dropping her voice slightly lower, "He woke up earlier this week than he has in any week over the last 2 years. I've been watching him. And last night when I went to fetch water at midnight, his bedroom lamp was still burning. In 2 years, not once." Olivia sat staring at the letter on the table for a very long moment. Then she picked up the letter, folded it with meticulous care, and slipped it back into its envelope. She tucked the envelope straight into her suitcase. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Martha stood up from the bed, smoothed her skirt out slowly, and walked out of the room the exact same way she had walked in. That night, after dinner, Olivia stepped out onto the porch, just as it had become her habit to do. The sky was exactly the way it gets out in the country at night, devoid of any competition from artificial light trying to steal the space that rightfully belongs to the stars. She sat in the chair, her arms folded tightly over her knees, staring out at the yard where the red dirt lost its vibrant color in the darkness and turned into nothing more than a flat expanse of shadow. The minutes slipped by. Rusty appeared from somewhere, sniffed the hem of her skirt, and wandered off again. She was right on the edge of dozing off in the chair when she heard the heavy door open. Marcus stepped out holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one down on the small table right next to her without saying a word, walked over to the chair a little further down, and sat looking out at the exact same sky. She wrapped both her hands around the mug and felt the heat seeping into her palms. The tea was lemon balm, which Martha grew down in the corner of the garden, and it smelled of something brilliantly green and faintly sweet. They sat in complete silence for a very long time. There was only the droning sound of the crickets, the wind rustling slowly through the leaves of the yard trees, and the deep smell of the prairie at night, which she had learned how to parse into separate layers. The baked earth, a faintly floral scent she couldn't quite name. and the smell of warm wood that she had come to associate specifically with that very porch. Then he said, without looking at her directly, using that voice that sounded just a little different, the one she had learned to recognize as the voice he used when he was saying something that didn't come out without a cost, that letter. "Have you decided anything yet?" She waited a single second before answering. She said not completely. He said it sounded like a fine offer. She said it did. He said she deserved a good place. She said she knew that. The silence fell again, but it was a vastly different silence from all the ones before. It held heavy weight. It took on the exact shape of things left unspoken that had been unspoken for far too long. She said, with that direct, unwavering voice that was her trademark, that sometimes a good place isn't the one that looks good on paper. That sometimes it has to do with what a person feels when they wake up in the morning, before they've even had the chance to think about anything else. Marcus turned and looked at her then. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the sky. He asked, his voice dropping lower, "What do you feel when you wake up in the morning?" She waited for a moment. Then she said, "That the coffee I make is going to be drank by someone who will notice if it tastes any different." The silence that rolled in after that was incredibly long and completely full all at once. Marcus sat looking right at her, and she finally turned her head and looked right back at him. And it was the very first time the two of them had held each other's gaze for that length of time without one pulling away before the other. He said, with a voice that was quieter than absolutely anything she had ever heard come out of him before, "Stay." Just that, a single word. With all the brutal economy of a man who hoards his words because he fully understands the heavy weight they carry. And she said, her eyes still locked squarely on his, "I am." What shifted after that night on the porch did not shift in any loud or noisy way. There were no grand formal declarations. There was no highly dramatic gesture that could be pointed to as the exact moment everything flipped over. What happened was a quiet series of very small things that began stacking up with the steady precision of someone who knows they are building something that requires a solid foundation before it gets walls, and that walls without a proper foundation do not last. He started saying her name. It seemed like a simple thing, but it wasn't. For weeks he had said "you," or he hadn't said anything at all, and suddenly there was an Olivia appearing right before his sentences in a completely natural way, as if he had been practicing it internally and had finally reached the conclusion that it was the proper way. She started asking questions about Anna, not all at once, not with a curiosity that felt invasive, but in small, gentle questions that arose naturally from the middle of a conversation. What she had liked to plant in the garden, the recipe for the buttermilk biscuits that Martha still baked, exactly the way Anna had taught her. Questions that revealed a living woman, and not just a heavy absence. And Marcus began answering slowly, with that profound economy of words that was his way, but answering genuinely. And there was, in the very act of speaking about Anna to Olivia, something he hadn't found in a single one of the silences of the previous 2 years. As if speaking the words made the memory significantly less heavy. Not smaller, not more distant, just less heavy. Martha watched it all unfold with the deeply specific satisfaction of someone who planted a seed without any real certainty it would sprout, and then, after some time, sees the green pushing up, timid but entirely real, above the dark soil. It was on a warm July afternoon that Marcus walked into the parlour where Olivia was sewing, holding the book in his hand. She recognized the worn cover instantly from across the room, because she had spent years with that exact same book in her own house, and knew the colour and shape of the cover the way one knows the face of someone familiar. He stopped for a second near the doorway. Then he stepped closer, flipped the book open to page 112. The folded crease was deeply yellowed by time, pressed down with the care of someone marking their spot, fully intending to return to it. He explained, with a voice that was quiet and exceedingly direct, without softening the ground with any unnecessary words. That had been the absolute last page Anna had read. That for 2 solid years he had opened the book to that exact spot every single night before sleep, read the 2 lines, and closed it. Olivia stopped her sewing. She sat looking at the open page he was showing her, at the crease that time had turned yellow, at the 2 lines resting at the very top, about 2 characters standing at a window watching the rain. He said, "But last week I turned the page." She lifted her eyes up to meet his. He told her he had turned the page, that he had read all the way to the very end over the course of that week, slowly, and that he had felt, upon finishing it, nothing of what he had so deeply feared feeling for 2 years. Not the sting of betrayal, not the abandonment of a sacred memory. He had felt something far closer to the clear understanding that a thing can reach its final end, and that end does not magically erase what it was while it existed, that the ending does not undo the before. Olivia sat looking at him for a long moment. Then she said, with a voice that wavered ever so slightly at the edges, "Thank you for telling me that." He said she was the only person he wanted to tell it to, and then, without any dramatics and without any rush, he closed the book and set it gently on the table beside her. He stood perfectly still in front of her, and she folded the fabric she was working on, placed it in the basket, and stood up. They stood at a very short distance from each other, and he reached out his hand. She placed her hand directly into his. It was not a calculated gesture. It was the entirely natural continuation of everything that had been quietly built over those passing months. Coffee sweetened with unasked-for sugar, the name of a tree scribbled on a folded paper, a broken sandal repaired without comment, silence shared evenly on a dark porch, a book that had finally, at long last, reached its end. And if you are liking this story and want to see more stories just like this one, leave a like and share it with someone who believes in love that grows slowly and stays forever. Gerald returned to the ranch during the first week of August. This time, as he pulled into the yard and saw the 2 of them sitting on the porch, Olivia sewing and Marcus sitting right beside her with the ledger book open, he slowed the truck down before he even stepped out. He sat there for a second, with his hand resting on the door handle, just looking. Then he stepped out, flashing that massive smile that was his trademark smile, walked his way across the yard, and announced that the ranch was looking different all over again. Marcus said he didn't have the faintest idea what he was talking about. Gerald said, his smile growing even wider, "Sure you do." Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway at that exact moment. She took in the entire scene all at once. She turned and went right back inside without saying a word, but there was in the set of her shoulders the highly specific posture of someone profoundly satisfied with the result of a piece of work that took a long time to do right. That night, the 4 of them ate dinner together for the very first time, and the table carried that distinct quality of sound that separates a mere meal from a true gathering. Conversation that starts on one topic and lands on another without any warning. Stories that one person begins and the other finishes without it feeling remotely strange, and that kind of laughter that slips out before a person even decides if they are going to laugh. Marcus looked over at Olivia right in the middle of one of those stories Gerald was spinning. A road tale involving a runaway steer and a Texas cattle auction that had to shut down for a half-hour because of it. She was laughing, her real laugh that wasn't discreet or calculated, the kind that escapes before a person can catch it. Her eyes squinted tight and her hand pressed over her mouth afterward, and there was, in those eyes, once the laughter settled back into calm, a light that he recognized without needing a single word to name it. It was the brilliant light of someone who was finally home. A few years passed by. The St. Thomas Ranch remained St. Thomas, with the same red dirt, the same cattle out in the pasture, the same prairie sun that never bothered asking permission to beat down hard. But it was difficult to find anyone who knew the place who didn't immediately notice that it had shifted in quality. Not in its physical structure, but in its quality, that intangible thing that doesn't have an exact name, but that you instantly recognize when you walk into a place and feel deep in your bones that someone truly lives there. There was a garden that hadn't been there before, planted in a corner of the yard that had always sat empty, right beside the stone wall, filled with prairie flowers that Olivia had learned to identify using the folded scraps of paper that she had kept writing, which had eventually turned into an entire notebook, and then, too, the only birthday gift she had ever asked for, and which Marcus had gone and bought on a trip into San Angelo, taking 15 solid minutes just to pick out the right one in the stationery shop, an act which had left the shop owner mildly bewildered by the utter seriousness the matter seemed to demand from this broad-shouldered rancher who smelled of saddle leather and dirt. Marcus woke up even earlier than he had always woken up, a fact which Martha registered with silent, glowing satisfaction. Because early wasn't just early anymore. It was the hour when the two of them drank their coffee before the rest of the ranch woke up completely, sitting together at the kitchen table in the low light of the dawn, sharing the kind of conversation that only happens when there isn't a single drop of hurry, when the day hasn't even begun to demand anything of you yet. The book had earned a brand new place. It was no longer sitting on the nightstand. It was out on the parlor bookshelf, nestled between other books that had steadily arrived over the years. On a warm August night, Olivia had pulled it from the shelf and read it out loud to him, right from the very beginning, slowly, and there was something in that simple act that not even she would know how to name with any precision, but which had left the two of them perfectly quiet for a long time after the final word. Quiet in the good way, that fuller silence that speaks louder than any spoken word. Gerald came around with much more frequency than before. He claimed it was for business. Everyone knew it was for the dinner and the good company. Martha had stayed on naturally, without anyone ever needing to ask her to. It was her way. Whenever a place was good, she stayed. And the St. Thomas Ranch had become a truly good place once again. On a September afternoon, Olivia was standing out in the garden when the very first tiny white flowers appeared on the branches of the Texas olive tree that stood on the edge of the yard. She stopped squarely in front of the tree and stood perfectly still, just looking. Marcus had stopped right beside her without her ever hearing his footsteps, that silent way of walking that was so characteristic of him. She said without taking her eyes off the delicate blooms, "Prairie snow." He said, "You remembered." She said she had written it down. The two of them stood looking at the white flowers covering the branches with a frail delicacy that contrasted sharply with the dark, twisted trunk of the tree. The September light out on the prairie carried a completely different quality than any of the other months, more golden, more direct, and it struck the flowers in a way that made them look exactly like what old Ben had promised they looked like. Marcus stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, using that voice she had learned how to translate with absolute precision over the years, "Do you still have that piece of paper? The one from the afternoon of the trees?" She said that specific paper was tucked away inside one of the earliest notebooks, but she pulled a brand new piece of paper from her apron pocket, folded neatly into quarters, covered in the exact same handwriting he had learned to recognize from a distance. She unfolded it slowly. It read, "Texas olive, blooms in late summer, prairie snow." He wakes up at 5 in the morning. His coffee doesn't need sugar, but I put it in there anyway. He has a way of being quiet that feels more full than any conversation I have ever had. He fixed my sandal without saying a word. He said stay with just one word, and it was entirely enough. "I think this is where I stay. I think it's here." He read it. He read it twice over. There on the paper was her tiny, precise handwriting, and there in those lines was everything that had happened in a way that neither of them had ever managed to fully describe out loud, but which was right there, safely kept on a folded scrap of paper, exactly the way she kept everything she never wanted to lose. He folded the paper up with the exact same care she had always used to fold hers. He tucked it into his shirt pocket, right over his left side, and stood back beside her looking at the white blooms of the Texas olive tree. There was absolutely nothing left that needed to be said. There was only everything that they kept right on feeling. And that September afternoon at the St. Thomas Ranch, with the heavy scent of the prairie carried in on the breeze and the white flowers of the Texas olive slowly opening on the twisted branches, remained safely stored within them, both exactly the way things stay when you didn't plan for them, but recognize them the very second you find them as the exact thing that had always been missing. A young woman had knocked on a gate asking for just one single night. "Just one night, sir," she had said with the most profoundly humble voice she had ever managed to use, and she had stayed forever.